Navy SEALs are considered the ultimate example of military commando special forces today. They operate, as the name implies, on sea, air, and land. They can go anywhere and do essentially any mission they're called upon to perform. The question is, do you know where they came from? Because between sea, air, and land, there's only one of those domains where the SEALs really have their birthplace, and befitting a scuba diving channel, it is the sea part. And I thought today we would take a quick look at where US Navy SEALs actually evolved from. And the answer to that is, well, of course, it's a little giveaway, they are part of naval special warfare. They came from the Navy. Now, during World War II, there were a number of maritime-based sort of specialist units that were put together for a variety of different purposes that all can sort of claim to be have a bit of the birthright of the Navy SEALs. There were the scouts and raiders whose job was to reconnoiter landing beaches before invasions happened. But really, the fundamental basis for what became the SEALs were the Naval Combat Demolition Units, the NCDUs. And these were formed in large part in anticipation of the invasion of Normandy. The United States and its allies recognized that the Germans had set up a lot of coastal beach defenses on the Normandy beaches as well as along the rest of the French coast. And these are things that would have to be addressed in order for a successful landing to take place. There were obstacles to prevent landing craft from getting in, mines on sticks, all sorts of nasty tricks in the water. So the Naval Combat Demolition Teams, or units, were intended to go in at the beginning, in the first wave of the landing, and destroy a lot of these obstacles to make sure that the follow-up waves could make it safely to shore. Now, these were put together by, largely under the auspices of Lieutenant Commander Draper Kaufman, who is really the father of the Navy SEALs and the Underwater Demolition Teams, which is the group that we're going to talk about most today. He put together a training program to create the Naval Combat Demolition Units, amalgamating experts from the construction battalions, the Navy Seabees, from mine and bomb disposal units, basically everything you would need to put together a waterborne demolitions expert group. And these guys were set up, and they did in fact participate to a large extent on in the invasion of Normandy. There were in fact 34 of these teams that participated in the Normandy landings. They had a particularly difficult time on Omaha Beach, where they suffered more than 50% casualties. The Normandy invasion on Omaha Beach is in fact still the single deadliest day in the history of US naval special warfare. A little bit of an easier time on Utah Beach, where there weren't as many beach obstacles as there were on Omaha. But at this point, these guys are not swimmers. These guys are operating out of boats. In fact, the original intention of the demolition units was they're going to go up to shore in small rubber inflatable dinghies, and they're going to be wearing standard combat uniforms, and they're actually going to be safety lined to the boats so that they can't fall out and wash away from their boats. They'll use these boats to hold explosives, and they'll work from them to demolish all the various obstacles they need to get rid of. Now, the Normandy invasions went over reasonably well, and it's then that the Naval Combat Demolition Units get sent over to the Pacific, because while they would take part in the invasions in Africa and southern France, the real story of amphibious warfare in World War II for the US is in the Pacific. And it's in the Pacific where the combat demolition units transition to becoming underwater demolition teams. So the major galvanizing event here was the US invasion of the island of Tarawa, where the first wave of Marines went in on Amtraks, which are these big armored tracked floating vehicles. And that was okay, but they were supposed to be followed up by a second wave of Marines in actual landing craft, ships that would come all the way up to the shore, open a ramp like you see in, for example, Saving Private Ryan, and disgorge a whole bunch of Marines basically right onto the beach. Now the problem is the Amtraks were able to get to shore where something like 3/4 of them were destroyed by enemy fire. Something like 90 out of 125 Amtraks were destroyed by Japanese fire, while the landing craft hit reefs. It turned out Tarawa had a very long, very shallow plain leading up to the beaches, and the landing craft couldn't make it closer than half a mile to a mile from shore. And so they had to discharge their Marines way offshore. Those guys then had to wade ashore. They took tremendous, horrific casualties doing so. They still captured the island, but it was a really painful experience, and it happened because there was no good understanding of what the underwater topology was off Tarawa. And that is where the UDTs really came into their own. So UDTs started to get the job of reconnoitering landing beaches before the actual invasion and blowing up obstacles, or in the case of a lot of the Pacific Islands, blowing tracks through coral, which is painful to think about today. They literally went in and explosively demolished coral reefs, but it was to give access to landing craft to make these invasions possible. So over the course of basically 1944, there's a transition from guys in rubber boats, like safety lanyarded to their boats, to actual totally freewheeling swimmers. And they came up with some really cool methods for deploying and recovering these swimmers. In fact, there's some really cool period footage showing how this is done. They'd get a landing craft, they set up a landing craft, and then they tie an inflatable dinghy to the side of it. And then they have guys deploy off the dinghy, and they have a big looped cable that they use to pick them up. So when the guys are done with their mission, when they have mapped an invasion beach, or they've laid demolition charges on the man-made or natural obstacles preventing landings on the beaches, they'll swim back offshore to where they're going to be picked up. They'll all line up in a line spaced apart fairly widely, and the landing craft will make one high-speed pass down this whole line of swimmers. The swimmers hold their arm out of the water, hook it into this looped ring, and get pulled up onto the dinghy, and then from the dinghy they go into the landing craft. It's a pretty cool setup. And at this point, this is the first wave of the first force of every US Pacific invasion, and they are dudes wearing swim trunks, fins, masks, and carrying a knife. And that's it, and a bag of explosives. So they did some very impressive work, and their training at this point is already has the core of what continues to be US Navy SEAL training to this day. What they call Hell Week in SEAL training originated all the way back in World War II. See, the issue here is you have to make sure that the men in these underwater demolition teams are really hardcore guys who are going to accomplish the mission no matter what. They're not going to give up, because if one of them fails, it can mean a serious problem for a whole element of a landing force. It's not necessarily like a pillbox on land, where if you send a platoon to go destroy that enemy strong point and they don't make it, they fail, well, you can send another one. With UDT, if they don't get an open channel for the invasion, landing craft get stuck in the water, whole landing craft full of Marines get blown up and sunk, and everyone on board dies. The consequences are really significant for these guys in particular if they don't accomplish their missions. And so under Draper Kaufman's leadership, the training is really hardcore for these guys. It is, in fact, Hell Week of extreme physical stress. At any rate, World War II, by the end of World War II, there's 30 separate UDT teams. I keep saying UDT teams, underwater demolition teams, and they're essentially like 84 guys each. Each team is 14 officers and 70 enlisted men, and they've got 30 of them by the end of World War II. And they take part in every one of the invasions, amphibious operations in the Pacific theater in World War II. Now, after World War II, most of these teams are disbanded. The Army is largely downsized. But the Korean War starts only a few years later, and the underwater demolition teams would be used in Korea. And it's here that they start transitioning from specifically an amphibious assault preparation force to sort of the more general purpose commandos that the SEAL teams are today. So there is, of course, a major amphibious landing at Incheon in the Korean War in 1950, in September of 1950, and UDTs are heavily involved in that, prepping the beaches, mapping the beaches, guiding the first waves of landing troops on shore, that sort of thing. But they start to get used for other tasks as well, because there aren't that many amphibious landings, and the command starts looking at the situation and saying, well, you know what, there's this bridge over a river that we'd really like to blow up. And at this point, 1950, the Army doesn't have a whole lot in the way of small special forces commando units. Well, here we have these underwater demolition teams. They're good with boats, they're good with swimming, they know how to use explosives. Maybe they could just go up this river a little ways and blow up this bridge. And then, there's this tunnel. It's not that far, it's 100 yards off the water. They could swim in there, use their swimming for a covert approach, and then go up on land a little bit and blow that thing up too. And well, the North Korean Army is largely fed through fishing operations. So what if we destroy all of their offshore fishing operations? That's a great thing for the underwater demolition teams to do. So they start turning into a little more like commandos. Their mission scope starts to expand a bit. Well, in 1954, they start adding parachute training, because hey, what if we could deploy, instead of deploying off a boat, what if we just jump out of an airplane into the water, deploy that way? Why not? So they start doing parachute training. I should say in 1950, they take the first aqualung equipped combat diver mission in US Navy history. So in October of 1950, there were 2 US minesweepers that were sunk in a harbor in Korea. UDTs actually responded and saved something like 25 sailors from the wrecks immediately after the sinkings. But then one of the guys goes back the next day with an aqualung, which is to say a scuba tank. Aqualung is the name that Jacques Cousteau gave to his self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. Well, this one UDT member takes an aqualung, goes down to one of the minesweepers, and is able to locate its code books and recover them before they blow up the ship, preventing them from being captured by the enemy. And that, by the way, marks October 13, 1950, the first combat use of an aqualung system in the US Navy. I should say, there were underwater commando units in other militaries. The Italians are particularly famous for having used midget subs and limpet mines and divers for attacking enemy ships. Slightly different, operations that would come under the purview of the SEALs a little bit later. Anyway, as the Korean War, by the end of the Korean War, training starts to expand. And by the end of the 1950s, U.S. Admiral Arleigh Burke, after whom the ships are named these days, decides he's looking for a naval special warfare commando group. He wants guys who can put together all of the elements of unconventional warfare. So psychological warfare operations, guerrilla fighting, learning foreign local languages, underwater demolitions are a key element of this. Sort of all this Army special operations capabilities, but under a Navy purview as well. And what better group of guys to form the basis for naval special warfare than the underwater demolition teams that are already in existence and have been proving themselves and are already starting to expand their scope a little bit like this. Like now they're blowing up stuff on land, they're all learning how to jump out of airplanes and parachute into the water. And so in 1961, John F. Kennedy officially creates the SEAL teams, sea, air, and land, forming what we have today as the premier, that's going to be a controversial statement in military circles, but a tier 1 element of special operations commandos. And yes, they will operate anywhere in the world at any time to do virtually any mission they're called upon, but their roots come from the sea. And so I thought that was a cool thing to take a look at. And in some future videos, we're going to take a look at diving using some of the original UDT equipment and what that was like. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.